Hello everyone. In the previous video, that is operator precedence parsing part 1 video, we have completed till the construction of the operator precedence table, that is this table. And next we shall take an input string and do the parsing process for the same table, for the same grammar. Let's consider an input string and check for the input parsing process. So we'll see that process, how we can do the parsing with the help of this table. Let us consider an input string. It is id1 plus id2 into id3. So for the parsing process, we are going to utilize the stack data structure for the implementation. So we have stack and then the input string is in a buffer, and what action we are going to take for this particular for any pair of work. So basically there can be three options. So basically it can have an equal precedence or lesser precedence between any two values or between a pair of values. Otherwise, that can have a greater precedence between the pair of values. So when the stack element has a lesser precedence than the input element, then you have to remove that element from the input buffer and push it into the stack. That's the first rule. Okay. So the first rule is when the stack is having a lesser precedence than the input buffer, then we need to push that input into the stack. Okay. Otherwise, the second option is when the stack element is having a greater precedence than the input symbol, then you have to pop the top element from the stack, and you have to perform some operation. If an operator is there, then you need to perform an operation with the existing two elements which is already popped and which is already there in the buffer. For those two elements, you need to perform that operation. Let us do that process one by one. So initially, the stack will contain the dollar symbol, and then the input buffer contains id1 plus id2 into id3 dollar. The end of the buffer is indicated by the dollar. So the first pair is the top element in the stack and this thing. So dollar and id. So what is the relationship between dollar and id? So we need to check that table. So dollar at the row and id in the column. So this is your relationship. Dollar is having lesser precedence than id. So this is how you need to check the table. So dollar is having lesser precedence than id. So if the stack element is having lesser precedence than id, then what action should be taken? It should be a push operation. So push the element into the stack. So push the id1. So now the stack becomes dollar id1. Okay, and the input buffer is the remaining things, the plus id2 into id3 dollar. So now the next one. So it is id and plus. So the relationship between id and plus, when you check that in the table, so id in the row and the plus in the column. So id is having a greater precedence um, over plus. So what you have to do? You have to do a pop. So pop the element from the stack and keep it in an array. So let us consider this as the array. So the first element in the array which is available is id1. Okay, because just now only we have popped it. So now the stack becomes dollar and this is plus id2 star ID $3. Okay. So now what is the pair available? It is dollar and plus. When we look at the relationship, dollar is having lesser precedence over plus. So what we have to do? We have to push the element into the stack. So now the stack becomes dollar plus and then ID2 into ID $3. Okay. So now what are the elements? The top element in the stack is plus and the first element in the buffer is ID. So the relationship between ID and plus and ID. Okay. So what is the relationship between plus and ID? Plus is having a lesser precedence over ID. So if it is a lesser precedence, we have to push. Okay. Push the element into the stack. So now the stack becomes dollar plus ID2. Okay. And the buffer is star ID $3. So now the pair is ID and star. The relationship is ID is having greater precedence over star. So what we have to do? Greater precedence means pop. So pop the element and store it into the um, the next array. So already in that array ID1 is available. Now you are popping ID2 and storing it to the new array. Okay, so ID1 and ID2 is there in the second input buffer. Okay, so the stack becomes dollar plus and the buffer has star ID $3. Okay, so now the top of the stack has plus and the first element in the input buffer is star. So the relationship between these two is plus is having a lesser precedence over star. So which means what action we have to take? Push the new element into the stack. So the stack becomes S plus star and this becomes ID $3. Okay. So now the relationship we have to check is for the pair of star and ID. Okay. Star is having, as per the table, star is having lesser precedence over ID. So what we have to do? Push the element into the stack. Okay. Push the ID into the stack. So the stack becomes dollar plus star ID$3 and this becomes dollar. So now we have to check for ID and dollar. Okay. So for ID and dollar, the relationship is ID is having greater precedence over dollar. So we have to pop the element. So when we are popping, we have to keep it in the second array. Okay. So already ID1 and ID2 are available. Now we have got the third element into the array. Okay. So I'm sorry, this is maintained as a stack. This ID, whatever you are popping, it is maintained as a stack. So next thing is the existing thing in the stack is dollar plus and star is there. Here you got dollar. And so the relationship you need to check for star and dollar. Okay. So the star is having a greater precedence over dollar. What we have to do? We have to pop. So pop the top element from the stack. So when you are popping, if it is an operand, you will just store it into the stack. When you find it as an operator, then you have to perform that operation with the top two elements and then push the result into the stack. So popping the top two elements means these are the top two elements. So your new stack will be, it will contain, so ID1 is existing thing and these two elements will be taken out and the operation is performed. So it will be ID2 into ID3. This is available as a single element. Okay. So now the stack has dollar plus, and this also has dollar. So you have to check the relationship between plus and dollar. Okay. For plus and dollar, plus is having a greater precedence over dollar. So what you have to do? You have to pop the element. So when you are popping the element, what you have to check, if it is an operand, you will simply add it into the new stack. If it is an operator, what you have to do? You have to perform this operation on the top two elements of the stack and put the answer into the stack. So you will take, this is the element number 1. This complete thing is element 1 and this is element 2. So performing the operation ID1 plus operation and the whole thing. So it is ID2 into ID3. So this will be your element which is available. So after you pop that plus operator, your stack becomes dollar and the input buffer is also dollar already. As per the table for dollar and dollar, it is called as the accepting state. So thus you have reached the accepting state, which means you have parsed the input string successfully. Okay. So when you have to draw it, draw the syntax tree, or the next step will be the construction of the syntax tree based upon the actions which is being done. So in that case, how will you do it? So initially, what actions you are having and what you are storing in the action side. So initially, what are the values you are storing it here, that you have to maintain. So ID1 is popped out. Okay, so ID1 is there, and then ID2 is popped out. Okay, fine. So ID2 is there, and then again there is an ID. Excuse me. So ID2 is being popped out. So okay, a node is created for ID2. Then ID3 is popped. So popped. So which means a new node ID3 is created. Then comes the star operator, and the star operator is performed between the top two elements, which is ID2 and ID3. So here the star operator is performed between these two, and then comes the plus operator. So plus operator is performed between these two elements. So, so this is how the tree is constructed. Okay. So from bottom, and it reached the root node. So bottom up parsing for the operator grammar, for the given operator grammar. Okay, so thus we have constructed the parse tree. So for the given operator grammar, using some few steps. So the first step is computation of leading and trailing for the given variables. And then we did the operator precedence table construction. Finally, with the table, we constructed, we did the parsing of input string, and we constructed the syntax tree also. Okay, this is how the operator precedence parsing works. Thank you, students.